All right, guys, we are on to our last section. All right, so I just thought I'd recap. Section 3.1 was on lines. Section 3.2 was exponentials. Section 3.3 was logarithms. And now the last thing we're going to do, section 3.4, we're going to do quadratics. Okay, so what I've done, I think this is how I'm going to do it. There's actually 3 parts, and I'm going to break each of those down. So we've got 6 more videos. So we've got part 1A and part 1B, part 2A, part 2B, and then part 3A and part 3B. So we'll have these 6 videos to go. This together makes up 1 homework assignment. This together will make up 2, and this will make up 3. So there's 3 homework assignments left, but you'll have 6 days to do it in. What else? And so I'll tell you, I'll say part A is 1 through whatever, and then I'll tell you in the email, and then I'll say part B is whatever that is, okay? So I'll tell you each part. So there'll be 3 homework assignments, but 6 videos. And then we will have successfully made it through. A little bit different than what we were thinking, but we will have made it through. All right, so let's talk about quadratics. Now, the other thing is I don't have a note sheet, so I just wrote it out. So you'll kind of have to correlate. There will be a note sheet on eLearn. But otherwise, you'll just have to read my writing, which might actually be better because I write a little bit bigger, and so it might actually be a little bit easier to see. But I do apologize that it's written. Okay, so we are doing quadratics. Okay, so what is a quadratic function? What does that look like? What is a quadratic? If we're going to spend 6 lessons on it, right? 3 homework assignments, what is a quadratic? So a quadratic function is y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. Okay, and a, b, and c are numbers. So something like y equals 7x squared plus 3x minus 5. That is a quadratic, okay? It is a little misleading. Quadratic, right, actually has an x squared. Quadratic actually goes with x squared, okay? Quadratic function just has a value in for y. Most of the time, the first thing we want to do is make it 0. So a quadratic equation would be 0 equals ax squared plus bx plus c, okay? So an example would be 0 equals, I don't know, 2x squared minus 5x plus 4. Okay, so again, quadratic goes along with an x squared. Okay, all right, so how do we solve these guys? It's not as easy as a line where we want x's on one side, numbers on the other. In fact, you want everything to one side. You want one side to equal 0. Okay, one side. And what determines sides is the equal sign. So you want one side to be 0. You want everything to one side. Let the other side be 0. Okay. So this would be an example of a quadratic equation. Let's do 3x squared equals 4x plus 9. All right. That's a quadratic equation. That's okay. As long as it has an equal sign, it's a quadratic equation. The first thing we would do is move this to the other side. We want one side to be 0, everything else on the other side. We want x squareds and x's on the same side. Our goal is to have it always look like this. Okay. All right, and then we either factor, which we're going to practice, or what? Quadratic formula, right? Not everything factors, so everything works with a quadratic formula. Okay, we're not going to spend time, but the quadratic formula actually comes from, so it's technically another method, which is called completing the square. So if you've ever heard of completing the square, it's kind of a messy process. What they did is they just completed the square one time with variables, and they came up with a quadratic formula. So these two really go together. Okay, quadratic formula can be really messy, so they just actually did it with all variables, and believe it or not, that was easier than numbers, and that's where the quadratic formula comes from. All right, and then the other option, we don't maybe use this nearly as much as we should. I know not everyone has graphing calculators, but you can do it by graphing. Okay, we are going to focus on the factoring and quadratic formula. Those are the two things that we're going to do. Okay. All right, and then answers to the quadratic equations. Answers are called the solution, right? It could be called literally the answer, or something very similar to answer is solution. Okay, I mean, it could technically even be called the answer. But two other words that aren't as common are roots and zeros. Okay. Zeros are because what's the first thing we want to do? We want one side to be 0, so we call those zeros. Okay. Also notice, what's the difference between this and this? The y is 0. The y is 0. So that's why we call them zeros. Okay. And I'm not even sure where roots comes from, even though in higher math we like to use the word roots a lot more often. So I think in this section we do call them roots, but that's just the solution. This is just what x equals. Okay, whether it's the solution, the roots, or the zeros, we're looking for what x equals. Okay, so I know it's not a different page for you, but let me see if I can find that. Hang on 1 second. Oh, maybe I lost it. I might have lost it. That's all right. Let me just grab another paper. Sorry for the delay. Oh my goodness, never a dull moment. Okay, so you'll see on your paper that it says solve by factoring. Okay, and when it says solve by factoring, solve means to come up with the answer or the solution or the roots or the zeros. Okay, so solve means what does x equal? Okay, and then our first problem is what? X squared minus 7x plus 12 equals 0. And you guys have that. You guys have that. If you look on the note sheet, it's on the bottom of page 1. Okay, how do we factor? Let me grab my pencil here. It has to multiply to be this back number, and at the same time add to be this number. Multiply to 12 and add to be -7. Okay, so you just have to go off to the side and start thinking what times what gives me 12. What times what gives me 12? Now, some of you might say 2 times 6. Okay, but what is 2 plus 6? 2 plus 6 gives me 8, and I'm actually looking for -7. Okay, what's wrong with the -2 times -6? What's a negative times a negative? That gives me a positive. So this is okay. What happens when I add them, though? I get a negative, which is also great. -2 and -6, but it gives me -8. Okay. And what am I looking for? I am looking for -7. All right, so then I go back to the drawing board. What times what gives me 12? It looks like I'm going to need my negatives, right? Because that's the only way I got a negative. And make sure you take the sign in front. Okay. So -3 times -4. -3 times -4 is a positive 12. But what is -3 plus -4? A -7. Okay. So that's what we're looking for. So we take these two numbers and we put them in parentheses. X minus 3 is coming right from here. And then another parenthesis, x minus 4. Okay. And if we FOILed this, if we multiplied this back out, first, outer, inner, last, we would get this guy right here. So you can always check if you're still not sure, if you still have, if this still confuses you a little bit, you just put numbers in and then you have to FOIL it back out. Notice I'd have a -4 and a -3, which gives me the -7. And then last gives me the positive 12. Okay. And then you set each one equal to 0. I set this first one equal to 0. I set the second one equal to 0. Add 3 to both sides. X is 3. Add 4 to both sides. X is 4. Okay. If I plug this in, 3, if I did, and you don't have to do this, but if you do 3 squared minus 7 times 3 plus 12, what do you better get? You better get 0. If you plug a 4 in, 4 squared minus 7 times 4 plus 12, what do you better get? You better get 0. You were coming up with numbers, okay, that make this statement true. What can I plug in for x to make it equal to 0? Okay. Let's see, what else was I going to say? So you take each of these, you set them equal to 0, and then you solve. Oh, I know it doesn't say. Some of you might just be able to look at this. You don't have to do this work. If you have to, great. It's no big deal. If you can just see that it's always the opposite sign, your answer is actually the opposite sign because that's what makes it 0, then that's definitely okay. All right. Oh, and on the homework, you're going to answer 3, 4. All right, let's try another one. Now, the one on the note sheet is over here, but I just ran out of room, so let's just get a new page. All right, so find this one on your note sheet. It says 10x plus 25 plus x squared equals 0. Okay, so the first step is to have one side equal to 0, which we do. It doesn't matter which side. One side is 0. But this, we always wanted x squared x and then the number. You always wanted x squared x and then the number. Everything's on the same side, so I can just rewrite it. I can just put the x squared first, then the 10x, and then the 25. And it's still equal to 0. The goal is to have one side equal to 0, and then just make sure it goes x squared x and then the number. Okay. All right, so now we're ready to factor. It has to multiply to give you 25, and at the same time add to be 10. Okay, what two numbers? I think some kids do this. 25 for multiplying and 10 for adding. What could we put in these two circles where I multiply and I get 25, I add and get 10. I think we could even put times up here like that and plus here like that. So you just have to think about it. I think usually I try to do the multiplication first. If we do 5 times 5, what 5 times 5 is 25? 5 plus 5 is 10. Okay, so as soon as you know those, then you do x plus 5 and x plus 5. Okay, and it equals 0. Okay. Now, if you want to go right to your answer, you can. Otherwise, you do x plus 5 equals 0, and this just happens to be x plus 5 again equals 0. Okay. So subtract a 5. X is negative 5. Subtract a 5. X is negative 5. All right. So now the answer, you're supposed to have two answers, which we do. This one's just a special case because it's the same answer. So on WebAssign, it says separate your answers with a comma. This is a special case. If your numbers are the exact same, then you're literally just going to type in -5. Do not repeat it, okay? Just write it one time. This is a special case. Technically, we still got two answers, which for a quadratic, you're always supposed to have two answers. But every once in a while, it happens to be the same. If that's the case, then we're just going to answer it one time. There's one of these on the homework. Don't put a comma, just write it one time. Okay, all the rest separate with a comma. All right, now for you guys, you're going to turn the page. We're going to continue to solve by factoring. It is x squared plus 2x equals 15. Make sure you guys can see, which I think you can. We'll slide it up. Okay. All right, what do we have to do first here? We do not have one side equal to 0. So you do not factor this, people. Do not factor this. There's an equal sign there. We need to move this guy to the other side. It does make a little bit of a difference. So one side must be 0 before you start factoring. So you do have to take the time to subtract the 15 to the other side. Okay, it doesn't go anything. This has an x and this one doesn't. This one has an x and this one doesn't. So we just write it x squared plus 2x, but it actually is minus 15 equals 0. Okay, we need to take the time to move that to the other side. Okay, now we're ready to go. We got x squared, x number, and then it equals 0. That's what we need. So now it has to multiply to be negative. Take the sign with, add to be 2? What multiplies to negative 15 but adds to be positive 2? So we got to figure out what times what. That it's going to give me negative 15. And then what plus what gives me 2. Okay. What can we put in those blanks? All right. How do we multiply to get a negative number? One of them has to be negative. One of them has to be negative. So what times what gives me 15? I'm going to do negative 5 and positive 3. That's beautiful, right? Negative 5 times 3 gives me negative 15. But what happens when I add these? Be careful. If you need a calculator, grab it. This does not equal 2. This equals negative 2. And that is not close enough. So I had to go back to the drawing board. I got to try something else. But I was kind of halfway there, right? What happens if I do 5 and negative 3? 5 and negative 3 multiply still to negative 15. 5 plus a negative 3 takes me to 2. Okay. This, maybe I should write this, and I'll do it in red. I like this. This gave me negative 2, not positive 2. All right, I like that better. This is good to go, right? This gives me negative 15, and this does, in fact, give me the positive 2. Okay. All right, so take your time on that. It's got to multiply, take the sign with, take the sign with. Make sure you take the sign with for both of them. Okay. So what did we decide? X plus 5 and x minus 3. Okay. And then if you want to go right to your answer, that's fine. Otherwise, set each one equal to 0. Okay. Subtract 5. So notice my final answer is the opposite. Negative 5. My final answer is the opposite 3. Okay. So this would be one where I would do negative 5, comma 3. I would be back to putting my answers with a comma. Okay. This is not a point. This has nothing to do with a point. Both of these are x values. Both of them I plug in for x. Okay, one at a time. So I would plug negative 5 into both. I better get an answer of 15. I plug 3 into both. I should still get an answer of 15. Okay. All right. Let's see. What else do we have? Okay, let's see. We did that one. Okay, so now the one next to it. Where's the one next to it? The one next to it is, now this is a totally different factoring. Does anyone know how to factor x squared minus 49? This is just a different pattern. That's the hard part about factoring. There's a whole bunch of different patterns. So this one, you just have to know this is a difference. Difference means subtract. D-I-F-F-E-R. Difference means subtract. Okay? And these have to be perfect squares. Something times itself that gives you x squared. Something times itself that gives you 49. And at least the good thing is the pattern's always the same. You just have to remember it. Notice one side does equal 0 and everything else is on the other side, but this is missing the x term. This is missing the x term, so it's just another pattern of factoring you have to remember. You go right to your parentheses. So you don't want to forget about this one, because you just have to think what times itself. Times itself. Okay, what times itself gives you 49. And so that would be 7 and 7. What times, this should be, sorry, what am I doing? Okay. What times itself gives you x squared, and that is x and x. Okay. And then the signs are the signs are always positive. 1 plus, 1. Wait, I didn't say that right. The signs are always opposite. The signs are always opposite. It's always 1 plus and 1 minus. Okay. And then we're good to go. Then we set x plus 7 equal to 0, x minus 7 equal to 0. Okay, subtract 7. X is negative 7. Add a 7. X is 7. Okay. And again, if you just want to change the sign, that's okay. So we would type in the homework, or we would type on WebAssign negative 7, 7. Okay. Let's do one more of these. I know this is not on the note sheet, so let's just do one more of these. Maybe it was meant to be that we didn't have the note sheet today. Let's do x squared minus 36 equals 0. Okay. What we have to recognize is one side is 0. Everything else is on the other side, but I'm missing that x. So the good thing is, because I'm subtracting, I can go right to my parentheses. What times itself gives me 36? 6, 6. What times itself gives me x squared? X and x. Those are the same thing. And x times x gives me x squared. And then it's always 1 plus, 1 minus. Okay. And then if we want to take the shortcut, this would give us negative 6, and this would give us positive 6. Okay. Let's do one more. You can just watch. X squared plus 25. This is key. Because you are not subtracting, can't factor. You cannot factor this. Can't factor. Okay, even though there is a number times itself that'll give us 25, number times itself that'll give us x squared, if you are adding, cannot factor. That's why it's called a difference of perfect squares. You cannot factor if you're adding. All right, so let's change this. Let's see, let's do one more paper. Let's change this. What happens if it is x squared minus 25 equals 0? Notice that the x is missing, so I go right to my parentheses. What times itself gives us x squared? That's x, so that goes in the front. It's automatically 1 plus 1 minus. Now that I have the subtraction, I'm okay. What times itself gives you 25? 5 times 5. 5 times 5 gives you 25. X times x gives you x squared. It has to be 1 plus 1 minus. So that would mean my answer is negative 5, positive 5. Okay. All right, let's move on. One last type of factoring. Okay, let's take a look at this one. This should be back on the note sheet. This is on the note sheet. 3x squared plus 12x equals 0. So we have a third type of factoring, last type of factoring. Everything's to one side. It's equal to 0. This time there is no number by itself. I don't have the number by itself. So here you have to pull out, what do both of these have in common? What number goes into both 3 and 12? What number goes both into 3 and 12? And that is 3. Here I have 2 x's, here I have 1 x. So we can also take an x out. Okay, now we go through and write down what's left. If you get stuck with what's left, you divide by what you took out. You're going to divide by 3x. You're going to divide by 3x. This 3x goes out in front, and now you simplify. What simplifies here? The 3's cancel. 1x cancels with 1x here. So I have an x left over. 12 divided by 3 is, and this plus sign, let me mark it, this plus sign is right here. Okay, whatever sign is here goes here. 12 divided by 3 is 4, and the x is canceled. Okay, so this is called the greatest common factor. Factoring out, this is a third type of factoring. We're going quickly here, guys. Third type of factoring, taking out the greatest common factor. Okay, so now you let 3x equal 0 and x plus 4 equals 0. Here, notice it's multiplication, not addition or subtraction. So how do I undo multiplication? Divide. 0 divided by 3 is still 0. Okay, and then here, this is back to plus, so I subtract, and x is negative 4. So I think on the homework, I think it actually doesn't matter, but I think on the homework it says write the smaller one first. So we would actually write -4, comma 0. Okay, but I think you're okay if you do it either way. Okay, so that's a little bit different factoring. Let's try one more of those. It's paper. All right, let's do one more of those, and then we'll move on. Okay, let's take a look at this one. 2x squared equals 10x. Okay, we got a bunch of things wrong with this, right? First of all, I don't have one side equal to 0. Okay, so I'm going to subtract 10x to the other side. So now I have 2x squared minus 10x. These cannot go together. One has a squared and one doesn't. So I have to write them separately. But now it equals 0. Beautiful. Okay, but now I'm missing that number all by itself. I don't have that c value. I've got ax squared minus bx, but I don't have the c. So this is when we have to factor. What goes into both 2 and 10? What goes into both 2 and 10? That's a 2. Between an x squared and an x, you always take the smaller exponent. So you take out an x to the first. Always take out, when you've got x's or any variable, you always take out the smallest exponent. So I'm going to take out an x to the first. What does that look like? I divide by 2x. All right, here the 2's cancel. 1x cancels with one of those x's. So I've got an x left over because I had 2 of them. I only took one of them out. X squared literally means you've got 2, just like that. Okay, so 1x cancels with 1x. I got 1 left over. 10 divided by 2, my minus sign, this minus sign is going to go right here, minus. 10 divided by 2 is 5. And my x's cancel. Okay. And then I said each one, this is considered 1, so I do 2x equals 0, x minus 5 equals 0. This is multiplication. Just be aware this is multiplication, so I have to divide. 0 divided by 2 is still 0. Here we're back to subtraction, so then I add. Okay. So x equals 5. So here I would type in 0, comma 5. Okay, all right. That's factoring in a nutshell. And we'll, again, this lesson is just to get familiar with it, and then the next 2 lessons we'll actually use it in a situation. So the better off you are now, it'll just be easier to use a little bit later. But after all that, and I know we practice factoring in Algebra 1 and Algebra 2, not everything is factorable. It actually is nice when it is because it goes a little bit quicker. But not everything is factorable. And that's why midway through page 2, what are we doing time-wise? Is this, let me see, time-wise? All right, I think we'll start the quadratic formula, and then in the next lesson we'll finish it because it's getting kind of long here. Okay, so quadratic formula, I don't know. Let me back up. Let me flip. This is section 3.4, part 1, and I'm now going to make this A. Okay, and then we're going to cut it off. We're going to do one quadratic formula, and then we'll pick up B. We'll start the quadratic formula, and then finish the lesson. Okay, because if these videos get too long, it doesn't work. So this is A. We're only going to start the quadratic formula. In B, we'll finish the quadratic formula and then talk about one other thing. Okay. All right. So quadratic formula is x equals, because that's the overall goal, right? When I solve, I really should have x equals here. When I'm solving, when I'm factoring, I want it to be x equals. That's the whole goal. So x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, and the whole thing is over 2a. Okay, and remember, it comes from, I'll put it off to the side, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So the number in front of the x squared is a, the number in front of the x is b, and the number all by itself is c. Okay, and it only works if the other side is equal to 0. So you must make sure that your one side is equal to 0. Okay, and this goes over the whole thing. The whole thing. And that's what x equals. It's the same as doing this and getting x equals 0, 5. We're going to have this. Okay. All right, let's just try one, and then we'll stop this lesson. So solve using the quadratic formula. Okay, here we have our ax squared plus bx plus c, okay, equals 0. We must have it equal to 0. Okay, a is my number in front of the x squared. B, let's write it going down. B is my number in front of the x. And what is c? C is a number all by itself. Always take the sign with. So c is -1. C is -1. Okay, so now let's plug it in. X equals the opposite of b. The opposite of b. So the very first thing I'm going to write down is -3. Plus or minus the square root of b squared, 3 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 5, times c, which is -1. And you need to just take that -1 with. Okay? And then all over 2 times a, and a was 5. Okay, make sure, can you see? Okay, yeah, you can see that. You're plugging it into this every single time. Every single time. Okay, now we just have to simplify. X equals -3 plus or minus. I always like to do the bottom first. That's easy, right? I can do 2 times 5, make that 10. Let's make this a long line. Square root. Now it's up to you. If you want to type this all into your calculator, you can. For some kids, it actually makes it better. If you want to do it in pieces, you can. 3 squared is 9. Notice I have 2 negatives. What happens when I'm multiplying and I have 2 negatives? It changes it to a plus. 4 times 5 times 1 gives me 20. Okay, but -4 times 5 times -1 gives me a positive 20. Make sure then that you add those two together. Okay, so we should be getting the answer -3 plus or minus the square root of 29 over 10. Okay. Now, how many answers are there? You cannot do plus or minus on WebAssign, but it's a good reminder you have 2 answers. This is how you need to type it into WebAssign. X equals, and you don't want to do the x equals, but -3 plus the square root of 29 divided by 10, and then comma, make sure you guys can see this, okay, -3 minus the square root of 29 over 10. I think sometimes we forget what this means, so maybe it's good, and you can, it is programmed correctly this time, you can type this into your calculator, okay? So you're going to need to type in the very first key you're going to, when you click into the box, something to the right is going to pop up, and the very first thing you're going to want to find is the fraction key. So the very first thing you're going to hit is, there's a box that says, can you guys see this? Yeah. There's a box over here that says this. You want to click on that, and then you'll want to type this into the numerator, and then type this into the denominator, and then put a comma, and then hit the fraction bar again. Okay, you're going to have to do the fraction twice. Square root, there's also, over here, I think there's also a square root over here as well. Okay, but plus or minus means you have 2 answers, and for WebAssign, you have to type them in separately. Okay, we'll stop there just because we're getting kind of long, and then for part B, we'll do more of these. So don't give up. It's just our video's getting too long. If you get a little confused or before you do the quadratic formula, start watching video B.